Hey, welcome. We're live streaming. Hopefully, we're getting going here. I'm gonna get us started. My name is Kevin Campbell. I'm the CEO at Pale Blue Dot, and I work with Elizabeth Wendell, who is the president of our organization. We have um, a fairly global practice. We do work with governments and non-governments and First Nations and Aboriginal communities. In from Europe, North America, and in Australia. And and I'm also people might know me as the author of Family Findings, some research I worked on now 25 years ago, began working on 25 years ago. And along the way, I met one of the privileges of my career. I got to meet Judge Michael Nash, who's with us today at the time, which I think Judge and I met probably, I'm guessing, with Judge maybe 2003-ish, so just over 20 years ago, um, in Los Angeles County, where at the time were you chief judge or the what
As presiding judge
presiding judge
of our
of a
juvenile
very
court.
large court? How many courtrooms? Do you remember?
Well, we had about 60 courts,
Yeah.
dependency courts, delinquency courts, and what we at that time called informal courts.
Yeah. So it kind of, for those of you who may be connected to other systems, when you hear 60 courts, you kind of says something which you already know. Los Angeles is a really big place. There's a lot of humans there and a lot of complexity. And I think it's been said, would you tell me, I don't want to misspeak about your community, but I think it at times has been said that that LA County was the largest child protection system in the world. Have you heard that before?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we've
Yeah.
heard that consistently over the years, and I'm sorry to say it probably still is.
Yeah, although it's changing, which
Yes.
is what we're here to talk about. I'm excited to have an opportunity to have this conversation with you. I think when you and I practiced this the other day, my strong feeling walking away was I was really hopeful, feeling like as hard as the work is, that there's evidence that we're seeing a progress. And I think that came out really strongly in our conversation. So we'll get to it. I also want to ask the participants today, those of you who are with us, please feel free to use the chat function to join in with the conversation. If you've got a question, we'd love to. We're going to make this conversational. We're not going to put up slides and disappear. We're going to interact, and we welcome you joining with us in doing that. So Judge Michael Nash was the presiding judge until 8 years ago. Is that right?
I retired in 2015.
Okay. And Judge Nash was appointed, I think, to the office. I believe the office is called the Office of, or the Director of the Office of Child Protection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
For the County of Los Angeles, which is a different office from the Department of Children and Family Services, which is the child protective services service organization. And then there's a separate structure created by the Board of Supervisors, which was your office. Do you want to say anything about what your office is intended to do? Because that'll be new to people, I think.
Well, the Office of Child Protection is the result of a recommendation from a Blue Ribbon Commission on Child Protection that was created by our local governing entity, which is a five-person board of supervisors. And the commission was created following the tragic death of a child whose family had been touched by several entities in the child protection network in Los Angeles. And so the purpose of the Office of Child Protection is, number one, to help implement the various recommendations that were made by the Blue Ribbon Commission, and two, more broadly, to help facilitate better communication and coordination amongst county agencies and others on issues related to child protection.
Yeah. What comes to my mind as you shared that is I think a lot of people will be able to relate in their own communities to child deaths that have resulted in reforms, as we call them. Unfortunately, I think a lot of us could also reflect on reforms that didn't become reforms. And I think one of the hopeful parts of this conversation, because I didn't honestly recognize that particular part of the history here, Judge, is the impact that your office is having in catalyzing this shift to becoming a kin first system. I think maybe I could fairly say this is an example of a child death where it honors maybe the lessons from a tragic event in a way that I feel I think the county and the community and the board, I hopefully will feel good about the fact that it achieved a change. I'm certainly here to foster this conversation. I do have questions for you, but I apologize, but I'll probably add my own 2 cents, and we may not always agree, and people will be used to that with me because I'm pretty disagreeable. Um, but I want to, we have people from around the world joining us or maybe watching this, and some of the language that we use may be inside baseball, as we would say, and maybe not really relevant to their context. So the language of kin first system, I'm going to define it, and then I'm going to ask you how you might define it. But my particular hopeful view, my mission view about the idea of the implementation of a kin first system, it's a system that where children who may not be able to live safely with a parent, who have to be separated from at least one of their parents. Um, they their first placement or their next move, if they move at all, um, is to live with someone who knows them and whom they know, um, usually relatives or parents. And it is no longer then a system built on the idea or designed around resourcing foster care as the place children go when they cannot live safely with the parent, or a children's home, or a shelter program, or a group home, or some other setting away from the family. So it's a system that, as you'll see in this story, that probably fairly cannot any longer be called a foster care system because the majority of children don't go to foster care. And that's sort of my view. I want to get your thinking about it is in the way because you're living it every day. Um,
Well, I think if we look around the United States today and we look at what happens when children need to be removed from their families because of abuse or neglect, I still think that the significant majority of children are placed with strangers.
yeah,
And, that is, and that's the problem. Okay. And so, what we've been trying to do, certainly you've been doing for many years, and certainly this has been a hot issue for me for many years, is to keep as many children with their families as possible. Preferably, with one or both of their parents, but if not, then with relatives or what we refer to as non-related extended family members, that is, other people who are close to the child that the child knows, and so forth.
yeah, absolutely. I want to just before we move on, I want to contextualize this for our American audience particularly. But if you're not from or in the United States, I want you to think about this, the reality of what I'm about to share and what it might mean in your context. So we're going to look at the implementation of what some have called a kin first system in Los Angeles through the work by the by the division or is it the Department or Division of Children and Family Services?
Department.
Department. I just want to respect the name, the Department of Children and Family Services, and in its work with the Office of the Director of Child Protection, which is Judge Nash and his office, so and others, I'm sure. So I want to acknowledge that. I also want to put it in a context of California. California's legislature and their governor and CDSS, which is the state organization, have clearly said out loud the intention of California is to become a kin first system, no longer a a foster care system, but a kin first system. And Los Angeles and some other counties are really leading the way in doing this. And like the rest of the nation, there are some counties that are not yet leading and are working it out. But one last thing I want to say is I want to read a quote from a representative of the Biden administration. In March of this year, there was a first ever national kinship convening in Washington, D.C. that was hosted by um, I believe it was the Administration for Children and Families, and the person was Jeff Hild, who's a principal deputy assistant there. And I'll read a quote from him. These were the opening remarks he made at that event that I was fortunate to be invited to. And he wrote, "We must radically accelerate kinship care in the United States as the preferred placement for children who cannot be with a parent. This is the policy of the United States government." They went on to say that the administration's intention is to enact policies and regulations that make it as easy as possible for states to do this. So that is a long way away from where you and I met each other 20 years ago. And could you say something about, and at the time you would have been the presiding judge, what would you say about the reality of your system 20 years ago and your worry as a presiding judge? What was how many young people are we talking about? What set some context there?
Well, when I started in child welfare in 1990 in Los Angeles, we had about pretty close to 60,000 kids in our system. I became presiding judge in 1997, and we had like 50, between 53 and 54,000 children. Um, Back in 20 years ago, that number was probably 40,000 plus. The great news is today, the system in Los Angeles is about between 20 and 21,000, which is almost hard for me to really fathom. I never thought we'd get to this point, but I'm really happy we're here.
Yeah,
Now, the thing about Los Angeles is, um, you, Los Angeles has always indicated, that children, if to the extent they need to be removed, they should be replaced with relatives. And LA has always been pretty decent. We've always been in the 40% to maybe 50% and so forth. But the problem was, that number never grew. Okay, it always fluctuated within a couple of points, but but over the years, you've seen in many jurisdictions, including Los Angeles, a great difficulty in recruiting and retaining, good foster parents for
yeah,
kids,
yeah,
and so something had to give. And when I took this job in 2016, I said, yeah, look, yeah, yes, we do need to recruit and do a better job of recruiting and retaining foster parents, but that's not the primary solution. The best solution is to just keep children home and, serve the family that way. But to the extent that you can't keep them home, then make sure that they're placed with other family members.
yeah. Hey, can I add to that just for the audience, and just mention Rob Geen? I don't know if you know Rob. So Rob Geen, who was formerly at Annie Casey and before that at Child Trends and before that at other really important places, and he worked with the Congress. But Rob is with the Bipartisanship Center now and doing a project there on bipartisanship and child welfare. And they did a survey of the public about kinship care. And the question is one other people may be able to relate to from their own countries. The question for the public that was asked effectively was, thinking of a child you are connected to, um, if for God forbid you could not continue to care for them, who would you want to care for them? Not surprisingly, 90% or more people said they would want family or friends to do that. They did not choose the foster care system. And I do think that's an important component because I think in the industry we continue some places to debate whether we need a foster care system or whether we should have a kinship system. And that may be an internal conversation. But I do think in a democracy, it's important to pay attention to what voters want and what constituents want. And the message in the United States is if they couldn't care for them themselves, their first choice would be to have it be in their family or with someone they know. We saw a similar survey done in the UK with similar results, and it may also be in other places. But I do think that's worth mentioning here. We've there, in the 20 years we've been doing this, it's not been without controversy and not without difficulty and a lot of bumps, including sometimes encountering belief systems that we need a lot of foster care. We might even need more of it. I saw an article suggesting that yesterday, in fact. Still,
But it's interesting, while the public may agree with what you've just said, our systems have not traditionally acted that way.
that's right. That's right. And again, getting inside the details of a change from a foster care based system to a kin system. And this is kind of what I meant with the title non-negotiables, right? I wrote something in a conversation I had earlier with the group, and I said, how do you prevent uh, foster care? And I said, by preventing people from believing that children need foster care. The biggest first top line thing we run into are people who say children need foster care, children need children's home, children's need residential care, they need involuntary psychiatric treatments. What children need, and then is followed by a particular favorite program or favorite design. I think the first step to moving to a kin first system that from my view, is non-negotiable is stop arguing that children need a large foster care system or presence. Because what I think we're learning, and this is what I do want to invite you to talk about so people know what's actually happened in LA County, is you're not just talking about the belief in a kin first system, you're actually doing a kin first system. It actually is happening there. It's happening in other places, by the way. I saw in the chat, Scotland now has a larger kinship presence than a foster care foster care system. I know that British Columbia has made significant gains around and placing importance on kinship care in there, and there are other places. And but one of the things what I want to do is move from philosophical beliefs that we should have these things to the opportunity with you to what you in fact do have and have created. So could you start with how long have you been working at the implementation of building kinship care in the county?
Well, as I said, I started in this office in 2016, and that the Blue Ribbon Commission, had talked about the fact that we need to do better at supporting relatives, as well as doing better at recruiting and retaining foster parents and so forth. And I, stated my firm belief that we really need to focus on kin care. And fortunately, our Board of Supervisors agreed with that, and they instructed the Department of Children and Family Services to work with me to help implement this. The directive was to work together to increase relative placements, to make greater use of technology with family finding, and to do a better job of engaging families in the process. Because the point is that the better that you can bring families together to participate in the process and empower them, then the better off everybody will be. And obviously, hopefully you can actually limit families' involvement with the foster care with our child protection system. And it's a work in progress, but we've done pretty well thus far. LA County is a big place. I mean, we have 10 and 11 million people in LA County alone. And our Department of Children and Family Services has 19 different offices throughout the county. So you figure out with 10 million plus people, 19 offices, it's like each office is serving a good sized city, of its own. And so we proceeded by starting with two offices, and ultimately the process that we utilize is now in all 19 offices. But it took 7 years plus to train everybody office by office, make sure that we had adequate people, including those that focused on the technological aspects of family finding.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that in a minute, just to clarify like you've phased in, it sounds like you've phased in offices over the 7 years as your implementation strategy. And I think what that means is you focused on trying to do it well rather than doing it big to begin with, which is probably smart. And it's probably also fair to say that you've got, I think, is it 4 offices that have now been in for about a year's time? Is that correct?
Something like that.
And I'm going to guess that offices that are new to the implementation probably takes them a while. You've learned it has taken them a bit to get particularly good at it. Is that okay to say?
It varies from office to office because,
Uh-huh.
while we were doing this, starting with two offices and four and then 10 and so forth and so
Mhm.
forth.
Mhm.
Uh, I consistently published the results of what was happening in the involved offices. And folks in the other offices were paying attention. Okay. Now they weren't formally involved in the process, but they understood what was going on, the positive aspects of it. And so some of those offices probably started, focusing on this issue even before they got involved.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's competition amongst the offices. And
right.
so what we've seen is with the newer offices, some of them come in and they're just gangbusters with great numbers. And then there's a couple of offices that uh, um, have been lagging behind, which kind of bring down the numbers a little bit, but overall the numbers are still very good.
Yeah. And what are the numbers?
Well, what we've seen consistently over the years is this. When we look at the numbers, what I said is we need to look at the numbers in two different ways.
Mhm.
Okay. Traditionally, when we talk about relative placements, that's what we're talking about, relatives, and to a certain extent, the non-related extended family members. And LA, as said at the outset, was for years has been in the 40 to 50% range. And what we've seen in the offices involved, that the relative, non-related extended family member initial placement rate has been consistently in the 60 to 65% range, which is a significant improvement. But once again, I think it's all, since we're talking about kin care, kin includes relatives, non-related extended family members. It includes non-offending parents and so
Mhm.
forth. So when we include the non-offending parents into the equation, the numbers have consistently been 80 to 85%,
Yeah.
which is, you know, pretty exciting.
It's a very exciting number. For me, it has a particular meaning that I want to bring out for listeners here. Because we, of course, we've been involved in different implementations around the world and across the US. And I would just say that 80% number really grabs my attention because what we've been saying, we call it benchmarking in our context, and the benchmarking number we would use for implementation is we should expect to achieve an 80% impact. And you have done that and better. So we certainly have no problems with doing better than 80%. And I know some of your offices do consistently better than that. But that 80% number is really important. The average in the United States, if I remember right, is somewhere around 33 to 36%. And so first of all, and by the way, some do considerably worse than that. Some are in the teens. Um, But that 80% number, the way I would think about it this conversation, as when I say benchmarking, in terms of setting a goal for what is achievable, I think 80% is the right goal there. If you do better than that, certainly that's lovely. But doing less than that, I would argue with some exception, maybe there are some exceptions, but doing less than 80 would suggest to me that it has something to do with your practice, not to do with families. And you again, you've been at this almost, I think, approaching 8 years, and you've consistently maintained or very soon got to that 80% number. And I've been seeing the data along with your community as it's happened and reviewing it office by office. Thank you for opportunity to do that. And what's important is two parts of that. One is looking at the averages over time and what has been achieved and the consistent average. The other is the replication. The way you did the implementation has an added benefit to look at this experience. Is that what the and I let's give credit to DCFS here, to the division, right? To the department. They did the implementation. Their personnel, who are government employees, who are also union members, and that's important. They pretty consistently replicated a similar impact from one office to another. Again, there are some offices that sometimes have done less well, but overall, the story that I see in your data is a consistent replication by the department. And I think that is really important when we are not just talking about a particular practice implementation, but remember where we started, this has been considered the largest statutory child protection system on the planet. That's no small thing. I think you said before it's about 11.1 or 2 million people in the county.
Yeah, between 10 and 11 million
It's a
people
lot.
in the county.
And the other that I've read is, I read at least something like 144 cultures and 240 languages. This is a complex place with incredible levels of diversity, many social challenges and economic problems that continue to exist in the community. These are realities that are the background and the context in which the department has done this work over the last 8 years. And I find that really remarkable because I think that many of us will look at what you've done and think about our own realities and think, I don't know if we could do that. Here's the barrier. Here's another barrier. Here's another barrier. For what it's worth, pay attention to the bit of the details here. Um, I want to I want to get to something really also I think important and less well understood. And I don't Judge and I have done a couple of these talks in other settings, and we use each of them, or I try to use each of them to get the things we didn't get to before. And one of the things I'd like to make sure we hear from you about is another part of this that doesn't get mentioned, or I haven't done as good a job about mentioning as I should. And that was, as I recall, going back in time, again, 20 years ago, one of the things that the county was exploring and I was exploring was this family finding work. But there was other work being done, particularly something called P3 workers. And as we'll see, this turns out to be a hidden but really important thing to understand about how this implementation has been done, and I would say has been important in the successes that you're seeing. Can you say something about what the county meant by P3 workers?
Yeah, essentially P3 workers, for most of the last 20 years, P3 workers have been retired social workers who are actually working part-time, and they're the ones who actually do the family finding, utilize the technology, do the family finding to locate, identify relatives, contact them, see what they're willing to bring to the table. When P3 first started back in 2003, thereabouts,
Yep, that's right.
it
Yep.
was utilized exclusively at the back part of the system. That is, it was utilized when you had kids who were, now we consider them transition age youth who did not have a permanent connection in their lives. who were in danger of aging out of the system, we would assign the department would assign a P3 worker to them to see if they can find relatives out there, because it wasn't traditionally done the way it should be. That is, find as many relatives as possible, as quickly as possible, and see what they bring to the table. And when that's not done, it really messes things up in so many different ways. You get in conflicts between, foster parents and later discovered relatives, and so forth and so forth. So the P3 was used at the back end of the system, and it was actually quite successful
Yep.
in that probably half of the kids ended up with permanent connections. And so, from that point on, I was an advocate for taking family finding and bringing it to the front end of the system.
Yep.
And quite frankly, I'm sorry to say it took over a decade before
Yep.
we actually got to that point, but fortunately, we have gotten to that point. Now, an interesting point about the P3 folks, with our with the project that we're talking about that began in 2016,
Mhm.
okay, the social workers, the front end social workers, were the ones who were out there, finding relatives, in whatever means they could, and placing the kids, with kin, as we've talked about. But in that 20% or so cases where children were not initially placed with kin, then the P3 worker, which was a scarce resource, was assigned to that child, that case, for 90 days to see what they could do. And we would, and typically, somewhere around 42% of the kids were ultimately placed with kin during that 90-day period. So it's something that continued, and it should continue, as all throughout the case. So they've been very valuable. The great news is, with an infusion of resources, DCFS is in the process of now assigning a P3 worker to every case, regardless of whether or not a child is placed in foster care or placed with kin, because the idea is to find other kin, bring them to the table, see what they can offer to help the family.
Yeah. So I'm going to summarize that in a particular way, and then I'm going to add something else because it also responds to a question that I saw in the chat. A really important question. I'm going to reframe. So you took the family finding work that the county had been doing for the long waiting young people and said, we're going to bring it to the front of the system, what you called at the time upfront family finding. And just I'll mention, if you want to read about the research on upfront family finding, you can find it online. Just do a search for Los Angeles County upfront family finding, and you'll find two evaluations done by Child Trends, one of the initial pilot and its impact, and then a longitudinal revisiting of what happened to those kids comparatively, as well as other things. And so very valuable contribution from Child Trends. Um, but the other thing you brought to the front end was the P3 workers. You brought family finding to the front end, but you brought P3 workers with them. And I'm going to tell the story a little bit differently to make a point for those who are listening. This gets to paying attention to the structural changes that Los Angeles County made that are particularly unique to them. This P3 design, it's the only place that I know, and I could be wrong. I don't know everything that's going on every place. But this P3 design is really important because I would argue that one of the things it deals with is one of the things many agencies who tried to implement family finding did not deal with. And that is looking at it from the standpoint of what are the workforce barriers to actually making a kinship system really work. And so historically, the designs have either asked case carrying workers, in addition to everything else, to also do the family finding. Sometimes they've appointed a family finding worker to be in a unit or in 3 units or an entire section. That's not what LA is. They started smaller, but they still had a significant number of P3 workers at the beginning, those retirees. But what you've just heard the judge say is, as a result of the success that they've had, they're receiving support from the Board of Supervisors, which is the political governance of the county, 5 elected Board of Supervisors members, to fund the hiring of a P3 worker, making a P3 worker available to every child who's in receiving services from the county. I want you to think about what that means. It means that kids don't just have a case worker who does really important work. They additionally have a P3 worker. And this gets to the question, and the judge has sort of hinted at this importantly, to take that vision beyond just that children's first and hopefully last placement is with someone in their family or their parent, but that they also have an expanded community of support as a family, as a kinship family, and as a young person who's maybe had some real hardship in their early life and is in a process of recovering from disruptions in their development and other experiences like that we might refer to as trauma. Um, so this gets to the question, which is gets to, are we using family group decision making? No, but what one of the other structural changes that the county made that I think is unseen but really important is DCFS created a framework for certifying or um, basically confirming that their staff had become skilled at family meeting facilitation. And as I understand it, there are 3 levels of certification available to them, the third of which means that they're not only experts in family meeting facilitation, they're also expert coaches of family meeting practice. And so they're offering people the ability to develop professionally this extra um, this extra capacity for family meeting facilitation. And the context for LA County and California for that has not been family group decision making, although there is family group decision making in California, and they've been at it a long time, and there's some wonderful practitioners there. But I would argue it's been more child and family team meetings or wraparound based work that has shaped their practice. But if you're listening to this, how do you get to that benchmark of 80% or more? Well, certainly family finding was part of that, but these P3 workers have been incredibly important in that story. And especially, I think, in the period of time after 2016, moving that right to what I would call the knock on the door with families. And the emphasis on people becoming, developing their credentials to be skilled in the facilitation of bringing these family and community members together as a group to think not just about the placements of children, but about the support of children and their caregivers together. Is the way I tell that story work for you? Am I spinning a tale here?
More or less, the
Yeah,
thing is, the real heroes in this process are the front end social workers.
yeah,
They're
absolutely.
the ones that are out there, but it's really a combination of the front end social workers receiving encouragement from their superiors, and that includes, upper echelons of the department. But even with that, it's still a challenge to bring about what has been rightfully called by child friends a true cultural change, uh,
Yes.
towards this kin care first philosophy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, there are obviously different layers to that. When we talk to the social workers at office by office, to try and inspire them to really, be committed to this process. There are different things you talk about. Number one, you talk about obviously all the studies that show the benefits of kin care.
Mhm.
There's no question about that. I won't go down the list, although quite frankly, two of the more recent I think additions to that list are the idea that there are these longitudinal health studies that
Mhm.
show the benefits of kin care. And then, of course, not too long ago, Child Trends did a study where they suggested that kin care also benefits educational achievement of children in the system. So, that in and of itself should be enough. On top of that, one of the things that I always throw in there that may or may not make a difference is, hey, this is the law. The law says that we need to prioritize, kin first. But I think one of the more convincing aspects of this for social workers was the following. We said, that, nationally, the numbers are, between 30, 35, 36% of kids who are removed are placed with strangers.
Mhm.
Okay.
A
That
place with kin.
No, with strangers, 30 to
Okay.
30, oh, excuse me, 30 to
Kin.
35% are placed with kin. The
Right.
rest are placed with strangers.
Yes.
Okay. So that, that in and of itself, is a problem. Because as I would say to social workers, look, you folks are some of the most noble, part of an incredibly noble profession, and yet you don't get the respect that you deserve for the incredible commitment that you make, for the hard work that you put into this. And the reason is that you're viewed as folks who come in and break up families.
Mhm.
And quite frankly, if you look at the ratio, it's accurate. That's
Mhm.
exactly what's happening. But what if you can shift that ratio the other way? Okay, to where 60 to 80 or whatever the percent is are placed with children are remaining with kin, where we're keeping families intact. Okay,
Mhm.
then people start to look at the work that you're doing in a different way. You will
Mhm.
start to get the respect that you need, the cooperation that you need. And that's what we really need to do. Okay. And the social workers office by office, they got a lot of positive feedback as they started doing this work and the numbers started to shift. And so it feeds on itself. So I think that has been a significant factor. And I just wish that the system, the agency, the system, the county would do a better job of, promoting that work to the general public so that
Mhm.
they understand that this truly is a Department of Children and Family Services, not the Department of Children and Foster Family Services.
Yeah. There was a parent, I wish I could give them credit because it was a profound insight. When they said DCFS, their experience was Department of Children and Family Separation.
Right.
And that was the parent's experience. It matters who tells these stories, right? When you're on the receiving end of these things, it can look entirely different. And I do think you're making a point that we need to actively work to change that reputation to be seen as actually investing in the well-being of families and the safety of children in those families. And I do want to make sure before we wrap this up that we acknowledge, I apologize for not giving more time for this, but we there are other videos. You and I recorded a film with one of the regional administrators of one of the offices there, and what we heard her say is I'll quote her, she kept saying, I have to pinch myself, I have to pinch myself. And what does she mean? She said, I have to pinch myself because my staff are finding such satisfaction in the work they're doing. They're really doing social work. They're really excited to get to work and to be at work. And that is a very different narrative about the workforce than we've been hearing, especially since the pandemic, about the challenges of hiring and retaining skilled staff. What we're seeing in offices like hers are people that are doing the work they came to this work to be doing. And I think you make the point. It's important that the community and policymakers have a story that fits the work that's being done, which is families being supported, not broken apart. And that's the reality that we're seeing in the county. I do want to, I, just thinking about that last conversation you and I had. There were two remaining bits, and they just gave us an extra 5 minutes, so we got to use it. Um, there were two things I thought were so critical that you talked about, and they do really matter, I think. And we look at the dynamics that produce this impact in Los Angeles. And I think I asked you something to the effect, it probably weren't quite these words. kind of who deserves the most acknowledgement for the support of the success of this. And when I ask you something to that effect, your answer kind of surprised me a little bit, although it made me really happy. Do you have to remember who that was, or by their role, who I'm talking about? And there are five of them, and they're appointed or they're elected.
Oh,
Um,
supervisors,
the
yes,
Board of Supervisors.
yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so, when I was still with the court, I got in a little bit of trouble with the director of DCFS because I thought he was making promises that he wasn't keeping with respect to relative placement. And when I got in this position, I met with him again and said, I really want to help you, with this. And, he was kind of lukewarm to that because sadly, he expressed to me something that I think is a problem across the country. He said, "Well, the problem with this relative placement thing is, too often the apple doesn't fall far from the tree,
Mhm.
and it's too bad. I mean, it's one of the biggest barriers, to this work throughout the country, along with financial barriers, which we have resolved here in California. But by talking with, the representatives of our five supervisors, they're the ones who issued the directive for the department to work with the Office of Child Protection on this issue, and by that directive alone, the lukewarm director became one who was committed to this process, and that really helped.
Or an ex-director. Um, in that context, I really think that raises something important, and it's I think can be intimidating. It may be intimidating in other places, and that is the role the board has played, um, and in this process, the support they have given, the thinking they have given to it. Um, and I don't think we can underestimate the importance of elected officials um, being leading in these kinds of changes. I think I'll tell you one of the reasons for it is, in my experiences, we have been at this long enough to see some jurisdictions make some real progress around this because they had a particular leader at the agency who was really responsible for that change, who then left. They retired, they died, they got asked to leave. And we saw those systems sometimes very quickly revert back to operating family separation practices and foster care, not kinship care. They simply changed the direction. I think, in other words, we can't tie progress and changes that are good for families and kids and are good for democracy. We can't afford to tie it to individual leaders who have a shelf life. We need to involve political leadership and governance in those decisions and in supporting those decisions. And that, I think, is a part of the story that really matters. Um, Having said that, I think that it doesn't mean that we don't need committed leaders in the organization who have a shelf life to do their work. And I want to finish by doing something I think will make you uncomfortable. I appreciate, in the length of time I've known you, you're a remarkably humble person, but you've never let this thing go. Um, you've been pushing this idea for 20 years. And I think it's made a difference. But I think what you've been really smart about is the way you've developed the capacity through your encouragement of the department itself, and then also the staying engaged politically with appointed leaders. Because there's been more than one supervisor in that job in the time you've been doing this, right? You have elections every 4 years. Sometimes they change, so there's continual work to be done there, and I think that is really important. The last hopeful thing, and we better stop, was that we didn't come up as well today, didn't do as well at this, was the thing I heard you talking today in the current context, the things I heard you talking about, like with build these networks and bringing the family members together with the community, think in support of young people, is what really struck me as you were talking about qualitative. I mean, what you were working on now looked like how do we make the experience that children and families and parents have with this system better, more helpful, more meaningful. And what I really liked is this story, that one of the shifts of going from 50 or 60,000 kids in care to 20 or soon to be under 20,000 kids is I hear a change in the story. We don't tell stories anymore about how few kids we have in care. Instead, I'm hearing you tell stories about how we're qualitatively making the experience of being involved with the system better. And I wondered if you could finish by saying something about that, because I think that is an important part of the story. What do you want to see get better?
Oh, there are, in this particular context, I think the family engagement piece still needs a lot of work. I
Mhm.
think, we need to do better training of social workers as to how to engage families.
Mhm.
Now that we've gotten to the point where we're starting to locate more and more families, we have to, you know, figure out, how do we better engage them, to see what else they can bring to the table, whether it's respite care, whether it's, monitoring of visitation, transportation to services, financial support for their families, or whatever the case may be. That is something that, when we get to that point where that's done consistently across the board, then I think the system will have arrived, where it should have been. Okay, keeping families intact and empowering them. Um, uh, that's what this is about, so that ultimately, we can get the government out of people's lives.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna finish because it relates to a couple of the questions and we didn't get to them. I wish I paid more attention to them because they're great questions. But I want to offer again as a from where I'm placed in this a different way of thinking as we leave the conversation today. I think what I've said to you, there are two things I've said to you before that relate to these questions. One of the things we saw was we could see systems be create positions, train people who became exceedingly good at their family engagement practice. These P3 workers or family finding workers, they have lots of different names, family engagement workers, and they were really good. And they found lots of people and they could engage people really well. But what that kind of thinking did not deal with was the fact is that and we had a name for we developed a name for this, and it was what we called invited but unwelcome. It didn't change the fact that many people who had authority, decision-making authority in the lives of kids in systems themselves still believe that foster care was better or believe the apple didn't fall far from the tree or that this kid doesn't have a dad, even though every kid who ever had existed on this planet actually had a father. Um, so it resulted in the fact is that if you just tell the story of finding people, what you're not getting to is the bigger story, which is are the people you find going to be welcome. And I think what you've done and what DCFS deserves a lot of credit for here is I like to say that you solve the uninvited, the welcome but the invited but unwelcome problem. Somehow you solved it. People began to see these families as valuable on many levels. There was the person who would take the placement of the child, clearly valuable, but that wasn't enough. There's a whole family network there or system, which is also a cultural system, which is also a linguistic system. It has all kinds of meaning and importance. And I think that's the piece you need to pay attention to is you can get good and you will get good at finding families, but will you have narratives that in fact mean they're unwelcome? Um, and the last thing I would say about the opportunity of bringing families together who have faced many hardships and may still be facing hardships is what we've come to learn is that healing is always possible. That families might, in fact, face challenges, individuals and groups of people, and they are capable of changing what's been happening, of thinking about and working together on new ways to live. And in the context of that process, be thinking about where do the children fit in that work. And we'll have to leave it there, but I would say the important next conversations are about family meeting practice, are about healing, not just the healing of children's experiences, but families' experiences, and the learning about the practices that we call not family finding, but we call family seeing. Seeing the possibilities as you have done from the time that we met 20 years ago and have continued to do. And I just want to thank you, Judge, for doing this with me. Thank you all for who have joined for listening to our story. And I'll have to stop there because we're out of time. Thank you.